Hi, this is The Philosophical Angle, and I am your host, Chris Angle. I am the author of 4 books on philosophy, one of which is The Philosophical Equations of Economics. And these books are available free for viewing online at www.philosophypublishing.com. The purpose of the philosophical angle is to examine the nature of the concepts being used in current media and compare the essence of the concept with the usage and circumstances in which the term is being used. This week we're going to have a special program to analyze the speech on terror by President Obama on May 23rd of this year, 2013. So let's begin. First, the major portion of the speech was on the use of power. Naturally, the use of power was relevant to the Afghan war, and the president said that the Afghan war is now ending. In fact, he said, quote, "The Afghan war is coming to an end. Core Al-Qaeda is a shell of its former self." Unquote. So Al-Qaeda still exists. However, there is some comments out there by the Wall Street Journal. And to a second quote, furthering the idea here about the war ending, President Obama said, groups like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula must be dealt with. But in the years to come, not every collection of thugs that labels themselves Al-Qaeda will pose a credible threat to the United States. Unless we discipline our thinking and our actions, we may be drawn into more wars we don't need to fight, or continue to grant presidents unbound powers more suited for traditional armed conflicts between nation states. Against this, the Wall Street Journal made a comment in its editorial the next day, on the 24th. It said, "If this logic sounds familiar, that's because it is the way the U.S. thought about terrorism before 9/11. Terrorists were a disparate and minor threat, one that could be handled by law enforcement and intelligence, not by the tools of war. We learned differently 12 years ago, but now Mr. Obama is saying it is safe to return to that mindset." From this, the president went to his policy of drones, which has undergone some debate in the media and in Congress. With regard to the drones missiles and its policy of use, the Wall Street made further comment. It said, "One of the lessons of post-9/11 policy was to keep the pressure on these groups so they can't become comfortable enough to plot attacks on the U.S. That requires war powers like drone strikes, special forces raids, and extended detention." Yet, Mr. Obama announced that he has put new limits on the drone strikes he so greatly expanded. Hence, the Wall Street Journal comments that we've gone back to a pre-9/11 mentality. But nevertheless, President Obama concludes that, and he stated, "This war, like all wars, must end. That's what history advises. That's what our democracy demands." Okay. From there, the Wall Street Journal made an editorial comment that terror is likely to continue, and I agree. They stated, "The reality is that the terrorist threat is also likely to last for decades, and it may increase as technology advances. The single most striking fact of the Obama speech is that he never mentioned weapons of mass destruction. Yet, WMD in the hands of terrorists is the greatest threat of all, and no one should doubt that Al-Qaeda or Hezbollah or Iran's Revolutionary Guards would use them." Well, there are two thoughts missing from this scenario that we've developed so far with the president's speech versus the comments of the Wall Street Journal. Those two thoughts is the history of the Muslims and the content of the Quran. And why would this be important? Well, it needs to, in order to understand what drives some to terrorism, specifically those with a Muslim background, is they are involved with most of the terrorism throughout the globe. We need to look at what drives them, that is the ideology that drives these believers. And we need to confirm that with the history. So let's try the history first. Let's go to North Africa. This is the first crusade that the Muslims brought upon the neighboring and outlying Christian areas. After all, during Muhammad's life, all the populated areas were of the Christian faith, all throughout the Levant and throughout North Africa, into Asia Minor, up into Europe. But Muhammad started to spread the word of Allah by a long, continuous crusade, and this crusade was of a different type. It did not proselytize like the Christians, not by word, but the faith spread by the sword. It first began during Muhammad's era until his death in 632, but quickly thereafter it started to spread, and what Muhammad taught in the Koran and in the Hadiths, that is, the Quran is the major driving ideological book behind Muslims, and the Hadith, well, that's the sayings of Muhammad that were not canonized in the Quran. In 639, Amir began the invasion of Egypt. 632 saw the fall of Alexandria, and with it was an unmitigated brutality against the inhabitants of Alexandria. By 711, Muslims had taken all of North Africa. By 715, the Muslims had taken almost all of Spain, which they held for almost 700 years. In fact, they got as far as Tours, France, and in 732 were repelled at the Battle of Poitiers, just outside of Tours, by Charles Martel, nicknamed the Hammer. In 792, the Muslims from Spain tried again into France, but were repelled again. And in 827, invaded Sicily and held it till 1091. And by 846, they had reached Rome. Also, in 848, they reinvaded France a third time. So they expanded their territory to uncover all of the Arabian Peninsula, all throughout North Africa, up into Spain, and actually made it into southern France. But that's not all. They also had a crusade upward to Asia Minor and eastward into India. And these began as early as 634, just after Muhammad's death. In 1009, al-Hakim ordered the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Church of the Resurrection, which was later rebuilt in 1027. In 1056, he expelled Christians from Jerusalem and began hindering Christian pilgrimages. In 1071, the Seljuk Turks crushed the Byzantines at El Manzikert. The Seljuk Turks were from the eastern part of Turkey and what is probably today Baghdad in Iraq. And the western part was the Byzantine Empire, which held Constantinople. In 1076, Muslims conquered Syria. In 1095, Alexius I, Comnenus, appealed for help for the Byzantine Empire. And he appealed to Pope Urban II, who then called for the First Crusade. By 1206, the Muslims had conquered, eastward going now, had conquered the Punjab, the Sindh, and Delhi. And in 1098, the First Crusade commenced, and the last crusade was in 1248. By 1300, the Crusader presence was no more, and the Muslims, Crusaders, again took a look at Western Europe for the potential of invasion. And sure enough, it did. In Constantinople, the very seat of the eastern portion of the Roman Empire, fell in 1453. In 1456, Belgrade fell. 1672, Poland fell, as well as parts of the Ukraine. Finally, a turning point happened in 1683 at the gates of Vienna. They were finally stopped by the Polish leader, Jan III. Now, the date on that is pretty interesting, and one that probably will ring familiar with most of you. That was on September 11th, 1683. Perhaps Osama bin Laden did not choose his date without some recollection of history. So, now that we'll give you a quick outline of history, we notice that invasions pretty much took from Muhammad, during the time of Muhammad, who conquered the Arabian Peninsula. After his death, the Muslims spread out into Asia Minor, into North Africa, into Spain. So, but it didn't end there. Finally, the Crusades came along, and there was the invasions forward stopped for a while during those invasions because the Muslims had the problems with the Westerners coming to them during that time. But then as soon as they left, the invasions of the Muslims started again. Okay, why? Why this long history of Muslim crusades against really the entire world? They went westward, they went eastward, They went southward. They went everywhere. Well, what drives this? And now it's coming again. As the Wall Street Journal notes, terror will likely to continue. Well, jihad has arisen again. Why? Well, we have to look to the content of the Quran and what is the ideology that drives these people. To do over history as much battle as that they have been involved with, and it looks like it's not going to end. And why is that? Well, recently they've been able to start up their terrorism toward the West because they can now fund it with oil money. And why do they fund it? Why is terror such a part of their program? It's because of the content of the Quran. For example, Surah 9, verse 73. In the Quran, it says, "O Prophet, strive hard against the unbelievers and the hypocrites, and be unyielding to them, and their abode is hell, and evil is the destination." In other words, non-Muslims equal non-humans. This is the justification of slaughter. And thus, Muslims have little regard for non-Muslims. But what is the Quran anyway? The Quran is a collection of sayings by Muhammad that he said came from revelations from the angel Gabriel. And these collections have been gathered in what is now called the Holy Book of the Quran. So, Muslims believe that these words are actually the words of God, as told to his prophet, Muhammad. May peace be upon him. Well, you might say, well, it's just one phrase. That's it? Well, not quite. In fact, in reading the Quran, I must have read phrases, bellicose phrases. I would say I had to have read tens or scores of them. So I'll just take a sampling. Surah 9, 123. O you who believe, fight those of the unbelievers who are near to you, and let them find in you hardness. Well, Surah 2, verse 216. Fighting is prescribed for you, and ye dislike it. But it is possible that ye dislike a thing which is good for you, and that ye love a thing which is bad for you. But Allah knoweth, and ye knoweth not. This is not self-defense. Sometimes people say Islam is the religion of peace. This directly seems to indicate that this is not self-defense, that fighting is equal to virtue. Let's go to another. Quran Surah 9, verse 29. Fight those who believe not in Allah, nor the last day, nor hold that forbidden which hath been forbidden by Allah and his messenger, nor acknowledge the religion of truth, even if they are of the people of the book, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. And by the way, this is one of the final revelations of Muhammad from Allah. I think this one needs a little bit of explanation. It says the people of the book. What's being referred to here is the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament. Because Muhammad believed that he was the final prophet coming out of the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so he says with willing submission they must pay the jizya. In other words, if you're a person of the book, you have the option to either become a Muslim or pay the jizya, a tax. And it must be paid with submission, willing submission, as it says here in the Quran, and feel themselves subdued. So you have to take a lower status in society, pay a tax, and then you're to be let alone. So really there are three choices for the non-Muslims, especially of the people of the book. They have three choices, which is pay the jizya, convert to be a Muslim, or death. Those are the three choices. It also says in the Quran that religion cannot be compulsive. Well, most Muslims feel that that's true because you have three choices. So let's go to a couple more. Surah 4, verse 76. Those who believe fight in the cause of Allah. Pretty clear. Not too much doubt about that. And let's go to my final one for today. Surah 9, verse 5, because it's quite famous amongst the verses of the Quran, because it says, "So when the sacred months have passed away, then slay the idolaters wherever you find them, and take them captive, and besiege them, and lie in wait for them in every ambush. Then, if they repent and keep up prayer, and pay the poor rate, leave their way free to them." Or the poor rate is equivalent to the jizya, that is a tax. Although there are many more applicable verses, we'll stop with these and take up a couple of other points about the speech that need to be noted. Obama made an equivalent, and a statement that made equivalent Islamic terrorists with Timothy McVeigh, the IRS building bomber, which killed many people out in the Midwest, and called both forms of terrorism. I suppose, but they are not equivalent. One, because McVeigh was an isolated person. Although he had an ideology within him, he did not spread it. It was not an organized ideology. One that followers have come, and followers would then do as he did, other acts of terror. The Muslim used the Quran as a ideology to live by. And so it is throughout the globe, being one of the largest religions of the world. It may be at its core, that is, violence was used in both occasions, but the amount of violence, if we add up all the violence throughout Muslim history and compare it to McVeigh is insignificant. Obama further states that psychological problems are causing domestic terrorism. That may be, just like McVeigh. But ideological problems are causing terrorism worldwide. by the thoughts within the Quran. Finally, Obama said that Al-Qaeda attacks because they lack hope, because they are poor. I'm not quite so sure that this would hold up under scrutiny. Many of the terrorists, I believe, have been shown to have a source of income and have been well provided for. What drives the Muslims to terrorism is, as we have just discussed, the ideological thoughts inherent in the Quran and further in the Hadith that have been enshrined in Sharia law. Thank you for sticking with me. And this has been The Philosophical Angle.